on Open Book. It's a dear friend, someone I know a long time, have an enormous amount of respect for, a best-selling author, but also the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a prolific author, has written a number of great books, an experienced diplomat, a policymaker. And Richard, this is going to go down as, I think it's your best book. I'm going to explain to you why, because smart citizens around the country that love the country, I think this is a book that people are going to teach in classrooms. It's called The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. And it's almost a template for an American renewal. Back in the 1980s, maybe it was 1980, Time magazine had an essay series called The American Renewal. When I was probably 16 at the time when I was reading it, this is before Reagan came into office. When I read your book, I thought of that time in America where there was a little bit of a punch to the solar plexus and we needed to start to think about how we're going in a different direction. So tell us why you wrote the book, why you believe that democracy is in peril, and why there's tribalism, and why, even though the first name of the country is United, we don't feel so much unity anymore, Richard. And welcome to the podcast, by the way.
Lots to unpack there. Thank you. Good to be with you again. Look, it's not a book I ever expected to write. When people think of me, to the extent they do think of me, and it's not critically, they think of me as a foreign policy guy. But this is a book about us, and I kind of came to this simply because the more I thought about it, what really worried me was us. I figured that if we had sufficient unity and resolve, we would be able to generate the resources and generate the political bandwidth to take on all the challenges we face, from China to Russia to climate change to pandemics, what have you. But increasingly, I came to the conclusion that the biggest risk was internal. And if you think of national security as two sides of a coin, our ability to deal with the external side of the coin depended upon the internal. And increasingly, to me, that was suspect. So I spent a lot of time walking during the pandemic upstate here in New York. And then when I got back to the city around Central Park, just thinking about how we got to this point, and read really widely about things I'd either had never read before, Anthony, or hadn't read for 40 or 50 years since I was a kid. I don't know the last time you read the Articles of Confederation, but it had been a while for me. By the way, people should read them. It's stunning. The idea that anybody thought that the Articles of Confederation ever could have been a blueprint for a government is quite stunning.
Well, no question. But they were all spirited, enlightened men and women, mostly men, frankly. But I mean, they took a chance on that document. You know, not to interrupt you, but I think you'll love this story. I'm in the Oval Office. You could ask Paul Ryan; he'll verify the story. I did have many days in the Oval Office, but this was a particular. This was probably
over 10% of your time if you were there for 1 day.
9.1 actually. Don't chip me out of my time there, but I think it was a Wednesday, Richard, because I was only there for one Wednesday. But I just got to set the scene for you. I'm in the Oval Office, and Trump is telling Paul Ryan that he works for him, and Paul Ryan says, "Excuse me," and he says, "No, you work for me. I'm the president of the United States." He says, Mr. President, there are separate but equal branches of the government. And by the way, I don't work for you. There's like 3 different articles. And by the way, I work for the American people, as do you. But it was a stunning conversation. And so if you ever get a chance to run into Paul Ryan.
Actually, that's a great anecdote, because on so many levels, one, it captures the nature of our government, separate but equal branches, checks and balances. The idea that we all in the government work for the American people, not for an individual. You take an oath to the Constitution, not to the president or anybody else. The fact that this particular president, 45th president, would state what he said, what he did, tells you a lot about him. He does not have an understanding in many ways, I would argue, of the basics of American civics or citizenship. And it's part of a larger problem. I would say the same applies to a lot of Americans. We don't teach this in our schools, or if we do teach it, we don't require it. You can graduate from about 95% or more of America's colleges and universities never having been required to take a course in civics. Many of our high schools don't teach it, or it's what's taught is a couple of classes, and it's terrible. So here we are. This is a Holy Week. We're meeting. You and I are having this conversation. Today is Good Friday. Sunday is Easter. Well, Wednesday night was the first night of Passover. And Passover is a holiday where Jews around the world gather around a table, have this ritual meal where everything is symbolic. And what we do is we tell the narrative of the Jewish exodus from Egypt. And what's so interesting about it, we do it in the home because for much of their history, Jews couldn't have access to temples or synagogues or holy places. And the whole obligation of every generation of Jews is to transmit the narrative to the next generation. And that is proven to be vital for the ability of Jews to have survived the centuries and the persecution. And we as Americans, here we are in 3 years, we're going to be marking the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And one of the things we have essentially stopped doing is transmitting the narrative of Americanness to new generations. We somehow take for granted that we're born knowing it. And what I think the lesson is day in, day out, week in, week out, is Americans aren't born understanding the value of democracy or the obligations of citizens to one another or to the government or to the country if democracy is to thrive. We have got to teach it. We have got to model it. We have got to talk about it. We have got to call out those who violate it. And we're simply not doing any of these things. So you asked me why I wrote this book? That's why.
But you're saying a lot, so let's just go over it. We have this obligation to teach our children about the value of this beautiful vessel that was created for them. And we have this obligation to explain to them that this diffuse power, the separate but equal branches of government, has actually empowered the people. And it's led to more meritocracy. It's led to more aspirational opportunity. It's led to families like yours and mine living pieces or parts of the American dream. And what we also know, because you and I are both students of history, when you're in an autocracy or a dictatorship, you're limited in terms of your opportunity, because what ends up happening is there's uncertainty about the rule of law because the dictator is setting the law. You're uncertain about it. Corruption sets in. The people at the top of the rim do very well, and everyone else is in a scared, panicked state. And so America avoided that for 240 plus years. I guess the problem I'm having is the apathy, Richard. Mm-hmm. We know this, and you argue this in the book, that we get the government that we deserve. So what happened? How do we get so out of control? When did the civic teaching stop? When did the people just say, let's take everything for granted?
There's no single event. There's no single date. One is just the gradual erosion of civics. And from what I can tell, Anthony, there wasn't an anti-civics movement. The analogy that comes to mind is musical chairs. When the music stopped, all the chairs were taken up by STEM or other requirements, and civics was somehow taken for granted. We don't need that. People get it, or the Cold War's over. It's no longer a priority. So partially it just faded away amidst all the other calls on resources and time. Then we've had the whole change in the media landscape. We've gone from broadcasting to narrowcasting, and increasingly Americans occupy particular bubbles or ecosystems, which, shall we say, do not traffic in facts or the truth. I also think there's been an alienation from government the last 20, 25 years. Think about anybody who's under 35 or 40. What have they seen? They've seen 2 costly wars. They've seen 2 now financial crises. They've seen January 6th. They've seen gridlock at the national level. They've seen a pandemic that totally turned their lives upside down. They've seen crime growing. They've seen borders out of control, you name it. And so for them, they grow up and they say, well, what's so hot about this democracy? What's it giving to me? What's it delivering to me? So I think that not only have we failed to teach the value of our democracy, but I think I fear a lot of Americans are growing up and they simply don't see it. They don't feel it. And so we're seeing the alienation from government, what you call apathy. There's a sense, plague on both their houses. It's not going to make a difference to me or in my life. I think that's wrong, needless to say. And a lot of this book is a call to get informed and to get involved. Small numbers of Americans can have enormous impact. You look how close a lot of our elections are. Less than 1% of the people voting who didn't vote could turn things around. But a lot of people feel what you're feeling. I admit, I accept it, which is, again, the reason I wrote this book is I want to have something of a national conversation. I want people who preach in churches or synagogues or mosques. I want teachers. I want parents. I want others to basically remind people of why this experiment of ours is valuable and what it takes for it to survive.
I mean, it's brilliant stuff, and you're right about this stuff. I want to test a few things on you and get your reaction to them.
Sure.
We have 27 amendments of the Constitution. We both know that it's supposed to be this living document. Mm-hmm. Our last amendment was in 1993. That was, a procedural amendment. Mm-hmm. So the big amendment that we've had, at least in your or my lifetime, is the 26th Amendment, which was the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So, Richard, we're now 58 years away from that big amendment. Yet if you look at our amendments, we were amending, or on average amending, the Constitution every 8 to 9 years. And so what happened? Like, how did we stop talking to each other? How did we stop reaching a consensus? How did we stop saying, okay, look, you know what? This generation needs to improve this document, increase voter safety and gerrymandering. I'm just giving examples of things that may make the democracy fairer. Why did this generation just cynically say, okay, we're done with that, get into our tribal camps and start peeing on each other?
As you correctly say, we've had 27 amendments to this Constitution in nearly 2.5 centuries, and the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights were done right away. Indeed, several states said they would only ratify the proposed second Constitution of the United States if a Bill of Rights were adopted to limit the sway of the new central governments. We've really only had 17 amendments in nearly 2.5 centuries, and the founders made it difficult. The good news is we've been able to change without amendments. That amendments have not been the principal vehicle of political adaptation in the United States. We had, in modern times, things like civil rights legislation and gay marriage and so forth. There's lots of things that have changed in our society without amendments. The fact that it's hard to amend the Constitution, to me, isn't necessarily bad, because those who would, if we ever were to have a constitutional convention, it could be a free-for-all. And I'm not sure what would come of it. So I don't mind. The whole idea of the American government. You go back to Brandeis when he was on the court. I thought he insightfully said, the purpose of government is not to be efficient. It's in some way it's to guard against things. That's what conservatives do. I'm a conservative by instinct, an old-fashioned conservative. So the idea that it's hard to amend the Constitution doesn't bother me. That shouldn't preclude change. And most of our changes that I would judge to be desirable could easily take place under the existing Constitution. So to me, the problem isn't the Constitution. The problem may be what's happening at the state level or with the courts or at the federal level. It's in our politics. I don't think the Constitution is to blame. I think, in a sense, we collectively are. I mean, take the recent midterms. The idea that we just had one of the most critical midterm elections, yet over 55% of Americans couldn't be bothered to vote. That's not a constitutional problem. That's an American problem. That's a popular problem. That's on us, not on the founders.
So again, let me be cynical for a second. So if I'm a politician that's been in office for 40, 50, I guess Chuck Grassley's been in office since George Washington left office. We're just talking about where we are. I want to strain out these people that. Why would I want these people to vote? So here's what I'll do: I'll gerrymander my adversaries out of my districts. We'll have polar right, polar left. I'll lean on those two things so I can get my tribe to vote for me, and I can sustain my own power, even though this is not serving the people. So why would one of these politicians, because you do need the politicians to change.
Let me give you two answers. I'll give you two answers to that. One is I would hope that some of them Because you're right. A lot of them are doing that. We saw in some ways an example of it in Tennessee this week, to exclude people literally or effectively from the political process. One is, I would say, that violates the 10th and most fundamental obligation of my book, which is to put country before party or person. And if you really care about this country, you would never do that. You would not allow your commitment to this or that policy outcome to take precedence or pride of place over democracy and over the integrity of the country. But I'm not naive. There'll always be people who behave badly, who don't show that kind of character or virtue, to use the words of the founders, when it comes to politics. They have to be defeated then. What we essentially have to do as citizens is more of us have to get informed and involved and essentially reward those who behave well and penalize those who don't. That's politics, and it can happen. We got to where we are today because certain people got more involved in the political process than others. It explains, for example, how a lot of the gerrymandering took place, because people got involved at the state level and had outsized impact. So it has to be undone. And if the courts are going to refuse to do it, if you're not going to get commissions to undo it because those in power who see themselves advantaged will resist it, then the only way I know to do it is to get large numbers to turn out and vote. So the only way to just, only informed political involvement is, at the end of the day, the only remedy I know.
It's interesting. So let me come from another angle. Where is the entrepreneurial politician? Somebody gave me a riddle the other day, Richard. They said, there's one group of people that vote the exact same every single election. There's 144 million of them. Who are they? It's the people that don't vote. That was the answer to the riddle. Okay. And so who's the entrepreneurial politician that can create that new market for those people and to get those people back in the game? Anybody on the landscape, he or she, that you see, and what would it take? What would be the elements of the entrepreneurial politician that could create this new market? And that's what entrepreneurs do, right? They create demand for their product, and then they get people off of their couches into their stores or into their voting booths to buy the product.
You're right. So you could imagine entrepreneurial politicians. I want to create an environment in which an entrepreneurial politician could succeed. And again, it's why I want to have things like public service. I want Americans to begin to see the value of getting involved. That's why I, again, want to have civics taught in our schools. I want people to come away saying, hey, this democracy has actually delivered. And by the way, there's a lot of close elections where small numbers of voters can make a difference. And by the way, there really is a choice, to paraphrase Barry Goldwater. It's not an echo. There really is a choice. So, because again, we don't need to get all 150 million Americans who don't vote voting. 1 or 2 million would be plenty in terms of having a tremendous impact.
No question, that would be a big incremental impact.
So my view is to sort of set our goal, and I don't think that's pie in the sky, to basically say we want to increase turnout in midterms or in presidential years by 1 or 2%. I would think that is well within the scale of feasibility for any political actor.
I think it's well said. Let's go to the obligations. I'm going to read them to people. Just it's be informed, get involved, stay open to compromise. Boy, that's a big one today. Remain civil, reject violence, support the teaching of civics, and put the country first. So I'm going to start with the last one, because people in this country, when you say put the country first, and you write brilliantly about what you mean, I'd like you to articulate it here, because there are groups of people in the country that say America first, and it means a very different thing than putting the country first. Yeah. So separate the two for me, and help our listeners and viewers understand what you mean in terms of the civic idea and the ideals of putting the country first.
Yeah. Putting the country first has nothing to do with the America First movement. America First movement, whether the historical in the 1930s analog or the more recent version, is a kind of nationalist, almost at times isolationist political movement. Putting the country first simply means putting questions of American democracy in the United States before what's good for me as an individual or before what's good for my political party. I would think some recent examples, Anthony, those secretaries of state in various states where you had close elections in 2020, who basically said, even though I'm a Republican, I'm going to certify these electors for Biden because that's what happened. It may not serve my partisan instincts or interests, but it happens to have been the truth. And ultimately, that's what you do when you're an American. That is putting your country first. I actually think what Liz Cheney did was putting her country first in her work on the January 6th committee, and she paid a price for it. And that's part of it. I mean, when you go back to Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, he chose senators who often made compromises when compromises were controversial, or sometimes refused to compromise when there was pressure to do so. And it's just a willingness to take a step back and say there's more important things than my getting reelected. And I think, again, it's up to us as voters when we see that kind of admirable behavior to say, hey, I may not agree with this individual on every issue, but that's the kind of person I want to have representing me. And when we see people doing just the opposite, I would say, that's not who I want in Washington or in the state capitol or in City Hall making big decisions that affect my life. I simply don't trust that person. I don't respect that person.
It's interesting you mentioned Profiles in Courage. I'm old enough to remember Profiles in Courage. I have a couple of copies of it. Your book looks a lot like it. It has the same shape and some of the same colors.
It's short, also.
But Kennedy said that. They asked him. They said, "Okay, sir, Senator Kennedy, why is your book so short?" Jack Kennedy said, I couldn't find a lot of courage out there. That's basically what he said, right? So, go back for a second. Let's say I made you the Bill of Obligations czar of the United States, and now you've descended upon us, and you are going to start from the ground up. And so, one of the things you're writing about is supporting the teaching of civics, right? So, don't you think that's an elemental thing? We'd have to have a restoration of civics teaching. Why did we stop the civics teaching? What caused that, and how could we restore it? What would you recommend if you were the Bill of Obligations czar?
I would do two things on civics. One is I would do what the state of New Jersey has begun doing. Governor Murphy just signed into law a bill that requires in New Jersey schools young people be taught information literacy. Here we are, we're living in a moment where we're flooded with information on the internet and elsewhere. A lot of things are running around calling themselves facts when in reality they're anything but. So what New Jersey is going to start to do is teach young people how to recognize a fact and how to also know when something that purports to be a fact is not. What are good practices? For example, checking multiple sources rather than sole sourcing your information, understanding the difference between social media and other forms of media. So I really like that. It doesn't tell people what to think. It teaches people how to become critical consumers of information. So that's one part of modern civics, which is how to navigate contemporary information flows. Another is to be exposed to some of the basics, the things we're talking about, some of the basic documents. I mean, I find it shocking that a lot of Americans have never read the Constitution. Mm-hmm. I would like people to be exposed to some of the basic documents, the Declaration of Independence. They have to be exposed to certain history. Again, I understand just how controversial it is, but certain things have happened. So people should know about them, and then they can read different interpretations. There's no one historical school for the last 250 years, but they should be exposed to that. They should understand how government works. They should understand, by the way, at multiple levels, the federal level, the state level, local levels. They should understand ideas like checks and balances, representative government. There's certain fundamental ideas to a democracy that they ought to be exposed to. I think people need to have a certain understanding of some of the basic issues. So yeah, I would think that this is what we ought to teach in our schools. Again, I'm not interested in teaching policy outcomes or bottom lines. I'm interested in exposing people to the basics of our political history and culture and some of the things I write about in this book. I want people to come to appreciate or internalize What are the behaviors? What are the attitudes we need if democracy is going to work? So I love the idea of students debating and simulating various things, and then maybe switching sides at some point and learning that how to disagree. That incivility, shouting and interrupting doesn't make an argument stronger or better. I want to see religious leaders, by the way, standing up in their pulpits and saying, "Hey, there is no place for political violence in this country. I don't care how strongly you feel about an issue." Or having religious leaders talk about the looking out for their. We teach in Scripture, "We're our brothers or sisters' keeper." Well, why aren't religious leaders taking that scriptural reference and applying it to American society and say, "Hey, we have the obligation to look out for one another rather than just ourselves"? You used the word apathy before.
Yeah.
Another word I'd also use is we become stunningly selfish. This is a society that increasingly only talks about rights and what we're owed. There's not a lot of conversation in this society of ours about what we owe others and about our obligations.
Yeah, as well. I think it's well said. You bring up the Constitution. I had my first assignment in common law. Larry Tribe made us read the Constitution, and then he got us in the class. This is the mid '80s, Socratic method. What's the most important part of the Constitution? That's what he asked. And we went around the class, and there was a gentleman there. He went on to clerk for the Supreme Court. He was a friend of mine. He's now working for a big law firm in D.C. He said something so brilliant that I'll share with you. He was 23 at the time when he said it, but he said to Larry Tribe, it was the Commerce Clause. And Tribe was shocked because Tribe's whole thing was the Fourth Amendment right to privacy. And he said, why? And he said, well, the Commerce Clause prevented the taxation between the states, a result of which we created this amazing free trading bloc, single currency free trading bloc, which led to all of this great economic prosperity. And I maintain, this gentleman said, Professor Tribe, that our economic prosperity has helped us with our rights, has helped us with our liberties. Sometimes when people are in squalor, they have a tendency to get less obligated to others. What do you think of that? What's your reaction to that?
It's really interesting. I wish I'd thought about it. And there's a lesson here, a contemporary lesson, which is when governments don't deliver, say, economically. History suggests that people will be much less interested in democracy. I mean, democracies are vulnerable less to external invasion. I mean, Ukraine's an exception. That's obviously a democracy that's vulnerable to invasion. Most democracies come undone from within. And one of the classic or most famous cases or infamous cases is Weimar Germany. And the inflation, the devaluing of the currency, and essentially desperate populations, when the economy goes really badly, frustrated populations are willing to overturn democracy in the hopes that someone will deliver either economic stability or the rule of law and physical stability. And that's one of the reasons I'm so concerned about the failures of American democracy now and our inability to deliver, because it doesn't surprise me in polls then we then see people don't value democracy. And they're more willing to cast it aside when they hear this or that talk economically, or someone's going to promise physical safety against crime. And it's one of the reasons that it's so important that American government at all levels deliver if we want American government to be supported by the American people.
I think it's very well said. I want to step back for a second and talk a little bit about your upbringing. So, like me, if I have this correct, you grew up on Long Island. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Where did you grow up?
Small town, Valley Stream, Long Island, on the South Shore.
Valley Stream. So you're a South Shore guy. I'm a North Shore guy. We both love Billy Joel definitionally. Okay, so let me
Yes, sir.
let me
Roslyn, New York, Billy Joel. That's
right. There you go. At my father's place. You see, if we're both old enough to remember when he would ride up there on his Harley, and he would take a beer out of the refrigerator behind the bar and start playing the piano. And then there were no cell phones back then, so you were either there or not there to get to see him do that. Which was one of the fun things of growing up out here. But so that we have in common. What we don't have in common, I am not a Rhodes Scholar, but you are. You are a Rhodes Scholar.
Yes, sir.
So tell us about that. Tell us about the influence of a young man. I'm assuming you did this after college, right? That's what happens. Most Rhodes Scholars, right? So you leave now, and you've been given this prestigious And back in the day, it was a very hard thing to get, Richard. You and I both know how hard that was to get. President Clinton has it. Obviously, many of your friends in that community have it, but it's a very hard thing to get. You have now left your Long Island roots, Valley Stream, and you're heading off to Oxford, one of the oldest universities in the country, in the world. And here you are. Go ahead, set the scene for us. What happens to the young Richard Haass?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is I don't know who was the most surprised I got it. Me, my teachers. Anyhow, I remember the interview one night for the Rhodes Scholarship, and you had to have a dinner the night before the interviews with the people who would interview the former Rhodes Scholars. And I remember being looked up and down by this powerful lawyer, and he said, "For a second there, Mr. Haass, I thought you were wearing a suit, but I see you are not." I didn't own a suit, and I had a corduroy jacket and corduroy pants, and one was kind of dark green and one was light green, and that was as close as I could get. And I figured any chances I had just literally gone out the window. I remember I got lots of stories. The boat ride over, seasick the entire way. Getting to Oxford, I said I wanted to. I was Middle Eastern Studies. I'd done that as an undergraduate at Oberlin, so they call that Oriental Studies. So I show up at my first day with the professor I'd been assigned, and he was the wrong Orient. He was a Chinese scholar, not a Middle Eastern scholar. So I had a slow start, but I had a great 3 years, not because of the Rhodes. The title actually, once you get at Oxford, nobody cares. They actually think you're stupid. They think you're basically an American jock. So it doesn't help you at Oxford. What was great about Oxford is I had 3 years of studying history. And I just got steeped in history. All the history I never read because I wasn't a serious student, particularly when I was here in the United States. And I had a fantastic academic experience, great teachers. And then it was also interesting. It was the early 70s. So it was the stuff I was reading on the side, reading Solzhenitsyn and others, or watching what was going on in British politics, the breakdown of politics because of the rise of the labor union movement. The Labour Party went far left, ultimately sowed the seeds of Thatcherism. It was just a fascinating moment. So it all convinced me to basically, ultimately, I did a postdoc over there, but to come back and get involved in politics. It was just, it was so interesting. But it was the greatest education anybody ever could have had.
So the first job, you're coming out of there now, you've got this incredible pedigree. What's the first job?
I worked a little bit on the Hill during there. I was a aide to a Democratic Senator, Claiborne Pell from Rhode Island.
Sure.
I spent about a year there.
I'm a beneficiary of some Pell Grants, just to really date myself, right? I had to get some of those to help me get through law school. Yep.
Really decent man. Mm-hmm. Old school. I did a postdoc at a think tank in London, but my first real job was I came to the Pentagon in the late 70s. And I was offered a chance to work there. And I got to the Pentagon in mid 79. And later that year, two big things happened. You had the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and you had the revolution in Iran. And it was all, I had spent time in both Afghanistan and Iran. I had just written my doctoral thesis on that part of the world. So I suddenly found myself still in my 20s, having unbelievable opportunities to get involved in serious policy things. And indeed, one of the projects I was involved in was creating an American military capability to intervene in the greater Middle East. What we now call Central Command had its roots going back to 1979 on a project I worked on with a few other people in the Pentagon back then.
Very, very, very cool. You then, I guess, discover the Council of Foreign Relations. I don't know. Tell me the odyssey into
I worked at the Council was much later. I worked at the Pentagon. I worked at the State Department for 5 years under Reagan.
Right. You worked for President Bush 1, right? Or no?
For all 4 years for President Bush 1 at the White House. I was the Middle East, South Asia guy, Persian Gulf guy. So when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, that was my area of responsibility. So I had 4 great years working with that president, with Brent Scowcroft, with Secretary Baker. I actually think it was the most talented national security team we've had. Wonderful people, and really, I thought, major talents. Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense. Bob Gates was there. It was really an all-star team. I thought I didn't come to my current job, the council, till 20 years ago. After I had worked for Bush 43, I was at the State Department working with Powell when he was secretary, and I ran the policy planning staff, and I was also a roving envoy, did the Northern Ireland peace talks and other things. So I came here, though, 20 years ago to the Council on Foreign Relations. And, about coming to the end. 20 years seems like a long time. So, but it's been a great opportunity.
If you could remake the world, if you could create a post-World War II architecture, I'm going to hold something up here which you'll appreciate. It's a brand new biography of George Kennan. Now, my viewers, I get a lot of young viewers, so they probably don't remember Mr. Kennan, but he was the father, basically, of the policy of containment to help push back the Soviet Union and the potential aggression of the Soviet Union. He got wind of this basically when he was in Moscow. He sent a very famous cable back to the United States. He signed it with an X, suggesting that Stalin had very aggressive ambitions. This policy was put in place for 40 years, maybe longer. You correct me if I've got it wrong. But it was a time in American history where there was some bipartisan commitment. The Republican majority leader in the Senate understood what we needed to do alongside of Harry Truman. The Truman Doctrine came into place. And then we had a bipartisan 40-year commitment to the containment and eventually the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So 3 things I want to ask. Number one, is there a George Kennan out there now that has this kind of great ideas for America? Number 2, how do we get back to this long-term thinking? Because the Chinese have long-term thinking. The United States has sort of a 3-minute cable news cycle thinking. How do we get back to this long-term thinking and do the great things that our grandparents did or our great uncles did?
There really isn't any Kennan out there now that I see it. The analogous situation would be, Kennan came up with this doctrine, what we call containment, which essentially provided something of a blueprint, how to be filled in, for navigating us through the Cold War. Worked for 4 decades, as you correctly said. The problem was then the wall came down just over 30 years ago in '89. And the question was, what then? And I think for the last 30 plus years, the United States has gone about the world without anything like a blueprint, without a doctrine. We've had various ones. Different presidents had different priorities. And so the problem was, one, inconsistency. And second of all, as you suggest, a lack of often bipartisan support. So I don't think we have a lot to show for the last 30 years. We had all these advantages when the Cold War ended, and 30 years on, what do we have now? We've got war once again in Europe with a truly alienated Russia. We've got a looming Cold War or something like it with China. We've got Iran on the threshold of nuclear weapons. We've got climate change far outpacing global responses. We just suffered, nearly 20 million people worldwide lost their lives in a pandemic. We've got new technologies from cyber to AI that no one can figure out what to do with or control. So this is so I feel we're navigating this really dynamic, dangerous world without a compass, without an intellectual compass, and without much in the way of political consensus. So my cliche line is, if you're not worried, you're not paying attention. And it kind of in some ways circles back, Anthony, to the book. I don't mean to keep raising it, but the idea that what makes it so hard is the inbox, the foreign policy inbox is tough by any set of measures, given geopolitics, global issues, technology, what have you. But what makes it super tough is we have to then figure it all out given our domestic problems. And that's a lot on our plate at one time. It's why I think this is arguably, the most difficult moment in modern history.
And it's going to require a cultural reset. I think what you say in the Book of Obligations, if I have it right, we have all the base elements, all the ingredients on the organic table to reset this. And if we sort of follow these principles, this bill of obligations, we can get there. I guess what I worry about is the apathy that's out there now. I worry about the phone is taking up a lot of people's time. They're not as focused on these grand ideas, these big visionary things.
Hmm.
We don't have these aspirational, soaring rhetoric politicians anymore. And then when we do get them, they get blunted by the lobbyists, and they get destroyed by the wood chipping of the establishment. So, but let's go there. Okay? I asked all of our authors that come on. I come up with 5 different topics. Ask them to, in a rapid fire way, give us their feelings about it. Let's go there. So let's start with Iran. What's your reaction to Iran?
Iran is anything but a status quo power. I'd love there to be systemic change there. I'm not convinced that it's going to happen, but the economy is in serious free fall. But Iran's dangerous. It's supporting these a nuclear program that's parked just short of nuclear weapons, but they have a lot of the prerequisites in place. They won't need a lot of time to go there if they ever just decided to, and they've got all these militias they're supporting. So Iran is a handful for us at a time. We want to focus on other parts of the world, and that's a difficult combination.
China.
But China's a very different kind of challenge. Unlike the Soviet Union, China's everywhere economically, as well as growing militarily. I don't think we've figured out how to meet the China challenge, and it's going to take a combination of domestic renewal. The one area I think we're doing better, and foreign policy, building up militarily more in that part of the world. The partnerships we have in that part of the world could be important. Indeed, the single most important ally for the next couple of decades may be Japan, if we want to, in some ways, manage China's rise, and how China uses its power. But I also think we need more of a dimension of diplomacy there. We can't. Containment won't work with China, given that China is economically so involved in the world, and given its we can't do it ourselves, given that we also have obligations in Europe and elsewhere.
Russia.
Russia's the most alienated country in the world with the end of the Cold War. I think it's an interesting story about how we got to this point. Was it inevitable, given Putin and Russian political culture? To what extent did we help engineer it through NATO enlargement? That's a debate for historians. But the fact is now Russia's the most anti-status quo country out there with the capability to alter the status quo. So Russia's a handful. In the long run, I'm not as worried about Russia as I am potentially about China. I think China's a more defining challenge for American foreign policy. But in the short run, what Russia's doing in Ukraine and could do elsewhere it's the biggest immediate challenge to this country.
North Korea.
It's the most closed country in the world still. It's got a growing nuclear and missile arsenal. China could play a constructive role if it chose to. It has not chosen to. So North Korea, it poses a conventional military threat to the region, and it poses increasingly a nuclear threat, not just to the region, to the world. So, everything we've tried, whether it's negotiations or anything else, hasn't worked. So there are certain things in life that are problems to which there are solutions. North Korea may simply be a situation to manage. I don't see a solution in the works.
America.
Yeah, still the most important country in the world. Again, the real question to me is whether we will sort ourselves out. And I hope so, because the world can't sort itself out without us. But I think the jury is out on whether we will be able to find our way again, to put ourselves back on the tracks. Again, we're 3 years away from the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Now would be a pretty good time to begin that process, because I actually think our own future and the world's future literally hang in that balance.
Well, you've been very generous with your time, Richard. I really appreciate it. I think it's so well said. I'm just going to not interrupt you. The book is The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens. Before I let you go, is there another book out there that you're allowed to talk about? Are you working on something? Is there something coming?
Well, I'm still,
I'm trying to get you back on open book. That's why I'm asking. Is there
I
another
appreciate
book
it,
coming?
sir. Yeah. Oh, there'll always be more books. I'm thinking of two. One will be we talked about it before. What actually should Americans study when it comes to civics? So I may actually write a curriculum, what I think we ought to be teaching in our high schools and colleges. And then I might end up writing a book about what you and I just talked about a few minutes ago. How did we go from where we stood at the end of the Cold War, that remarkable moment of American primacy in the world, of possibility, to today?
Mm-hmm. Amen.
What explains how things have turned out? Because there's very little about history that's inevitable.
Yeah.
So why did this happen the way it happened? And how did we get here? To what extent was it baked into the cake? Or to what extent did we make big mistakes that we need to recognize and learn from?
Yeah, it's fast. I mean, I'm going to recommend something to you on the way out. It's and you probably read it already, but David Fromkin wrote a couple of very interesting books. One was about the Middle East, but he wrote one wasn't well picked up, called "In the Time of the Americans," and it was basically how did these neo-Victorian men born between 1885 and 1900 set the American system up in the post-World War II architecture alongside of our allies
Mm-hmm.
to create this great economic prosperity, and what they did and what their values were. And in many ways, they were I know we both believe in the great man theory of history or the great woman theory of history, but there's also like a great group theory. Our founding fathers were a great group.
Yeah.
And then there's a bad group theory, right? That's the Nazis that were taking over Germany, and we had a great group of people in the post-World War II era that really
the Wise Men. Yeah, the book by Walter Isaacson.
Wise Man and Walker. Another example, another rendition of that, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, no, absolutely. So the question is now, do we have them, wise men and women? And also, I think the times are tough. I think this environment, politically, given what's going on with social media and the rest, just given the sheer number of problems coming, I think this is a difficult time. It's a difficult time, if you will, to be wise, and then it's a difficult time to market that wisdom. So
exactly. I think you're in an interesting time where you have to entertain these people while you're also have to be contemporaneously a policy wonk. Okay, that's a rough ask, right? But thank you. I really enjoyed this. A great holiday to you and your family, and hopefully we'll get a drink. So Maggie, welcome. I look forward to this. Obviously, I read your book. I listened to your book on audio tape. Read the book. Why Con Man? Why did you pick Confidence Man for the title?
There were a bunch of titles that I was thinking about. One that I had for a while as a working title was Damage, because Trump is damaged and he has brought damage to others. Ultimately, Confidence Man was a suggestion that came up from folks I was working with. My sounding boards liked it. I frankly liked it because I think that it has a double meaning. Obviously, confidence is something that Trump tries to project, but the literal meaning of a con man is someone who takes something from other people, and I think that Trump has a very long history of doing that.
Well, I mean, it's a couple of things I took away from the book. First of all, I wish you had written the book before the campaign started in 2016, but of course you weren't able to do that. But if you had done that, it was a very big warning. And it's just interesting that the book's out there now, and there's still a very large group of people that support President Trump and will vote for him in the Republican primary. But the book is a Surgeon General's warning label on his personality. You go back to Fred Trump and the older brother, Fred Trump Jr.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to tell us a little bit about those relationships. And also, there's a fascinating story in your book, which I highlighted. It was about there was only one picture in the Oval Office behind the Resolute desk. That was him, a picture of his dad. People said, hey, man, you got to put other pictures up there. Explain the whole dynamic there.
So Fred Trump, there is no Donald Trump without Fred Trump, literally, and also, scenically. Fred Trump is constantly on Donald Trump's shoulder in one form or another. He was an effective businessman. He was a much more effective businessman than his son, who is a self-promoter, and an effective brander, but not a businessman the same way. But Fred Trump cut corners, and according to everyone who I know who spoke to him. He did not undermine his son in public, but definitely did in private, and was constantly pushing his son, in terms of killers and losers, and, you've got to be a winner. And Ivana Trump had a line in her autobiography in which she described Fred Trump as a brutal father. And I think that's probably as good a description as you can get of him. And I think that left its mark on Donald Trump. And I think, there was a striking line, too, to your point about him only having that picture of Fred, that he gave to my colleague Jason Horowitz in an interview about his dad in the 2016 campaign, when Jason asked what Trump's father would have thought of him running. And Trump said I'm paraphrasing, but it was, he absolutely would have allowed me to run, which was a really striking comment from a 70-year-old man. So I think it tells you a lot about how Trump sees himself and how he still sees himself as, secondary to his dad.
Listen, we both have had personal experiences with Donald Trump. My experience with him, which is not going to shock you, and you and I have talked about this, is remarkable insecurity. Like somebody
you've talked about that a lot. Yeah.
Somebody that rises to the presidency. Mm-hmm. Okay, just the bullying and the need to try to tell people that they're smarter than the other person. Insecure people do that. Like, I'm smarter than you. Let me try to prove it to you. If I can't prove it to you, let me try to intimidate or bully you. Is the insecurity coming from that relationship with Fred Trump? Is that ultimately what happened? He just brutalized the kid to the point where the kid just felt unsteady and unsure of himself?
I think that Trump comes to the world with his own, pathology. So I think I don't want to strictly attribute it to Fred Trump, but I absolutely think that Fred Trump undermined him, set up a competition between him and Freddie, his older brother, who you mentioned before, set up a paradigm where everything was about competing factions against one another, which, you experienced firsthand. And we've talked about that too. That's how he treats the entire world, as if it is, and as I write, that's a way of behaving that might work in a business. Sometimes it certainly is not effective in a family. And so I think that this constant, feeling that he is not getting his due and that he needs to prove that he is worthy, traces, I don't think exclusively, but pretty heavily to his father.
So I finish your book and I say to myself, okay, I'm going to write these things down and I'm going to ask Maggie about them in the future. Okay. So I finished the book. Here are the things that I wrote down. It was a perfect storm. And what do I mean by that? The country was looking for new leadership. The country felt that the establishment political parties, at least a good 25% of the country, felt that the establishment political parties were not working for them. And so you had this perfect storm where in comes this avatar for white, middle, and lower class anger. He's going to be their avatar, stick a finger in the eye of all forms of the establishment. And then you have the failure of the Clinton campaign, the Secretary Hillary Clinton campaign. Am I right about that? Is it a perfect storm? Is he a manifestation of what's going on in America? Did he help contribute to it, like the New York Times reported this past weekend? In terms of it, what did I get wrong? When I closed your book, I was like, okay, perfect storm. He comes into it at the perfect time, wins the presidency by a nose, and then he wreaks this type of destruction and manifestation of his own self-hatred on the rest of us.
I think one asterisk that I would put on there is, yes, I think that the Clinton campaign made some strategic errors and bad assumptions, but I also think that you can't underestimate the degree to which sexism is a real thing, and I think cut against her. I think that a lot of people, she's a polarizing figure. She has been for 30 years. I think that it was underestimated the degree to which people were going to view her negatively and through a negative lens. To some extent, regardless of what she did, a certain sizable chunk of the population. I don't think she helped herself in certain areas. But as for the rest, I think you're right. What I tried showing is that Trump is who he always has been. He is this very shallow, insecure, celebrity status seeker who, in a country that is increasingly celebrity driven, found his moment in the post-Tea Party era. He harnessed that anger when trust in institutions, after a series of national traumas, had really left a mark on a lot of voters. He told people he was going to fight, and he was branded as this successful businessman, Anthony, that he just simply was not. You're from New York. You know that the fiber view of Donald Trump is pretty different than what the rest of the country believed about him, beginning from the 80s.
Okay, but New Yorkers like me made a decision to support him, okay? And I can give you the cognitive dissonance, but I'm not going to. I supported him very plaintively because he was the Republican nominee. I had worked in the Republican Party for 20 years. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be loyal. I'm going to support him. Why do you think so many people did that? You know, I talked to Mark Esper about it. You know, I saw Mark Esper at the Army-Navy game. As I walked through the door, Bill Barr was there with Mark.
This is last year. This is last year. This past one, 2020, 2022.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm coming through the door. My wife Deirdre, Mark sees me, Bill sees me, and they said, "Oh, I didn't realize that we're here for the Trump fired person support network." You know, and I started laughing. I said, "Well, I got fired way before you guys did." But
it's true. It was not yet fashionable when you got fired. That's true.
It was a pretty sensationalist thing, and then it became commonplace. But why did we support him in your mind? Like, why did somebody like Mike Pompeo, Mark Esper, myself, Bill Barr?
Well, I'll answer that, but I would love to hear your
General Kelly.
I'm more interested in your answer, but I don't think that everybody.
I think my answer is distorted because you know that there's a very famous line that people remember things the way they want to and the way they need to, as opposed to the way they really happen. So I think my answer is perhaps less objective than yours. You know, my answer, my simple answer is I supported him because I was loyal to the party. When he went rogue, I decided to ignore a lot of it under the theory that his policies were better than the other person's policies. And so let's ignore that. But ultimately, I have to own that because the license for hatred, the acrimony, the racial tension that he caused, as I've said to Esper and Pompeo, Bill Barr, others, were all accomplices to that. You know, and we could say we did it by accident or we did it proactively, but and I've offered my apology to people for doing that. It is what it is. But ultimately, I think it was a power trip. Ultimately, if we're being honest with ourselves, it's ego that helped influence our decision making. So, and I don't care who you are. You have the opportunity to work in the White House. You know, I was a blue collar kid, built some successful businesses. I can now work for the American president. I was overly tempted by that. I think that's ultimately the most honest answer I can give. But I'm more asking generically. You've interviewed a lot of these people. Why did they go work for him?
I think that for the group that you just put forward, and I think the more extended group of people who work for Donald Trump who either were fired or don't feel good about it or took issues with him. Look, I think that for a lot of people, it's the same reason that you cited at the outset. It's that they tended to skew Republican, and he's a Republican. He was the Republican nominee. He was the Republican president. So I think that's a piece of it. I think in the case of General Kelly, I think it's slightly different. I think military figures are slightly different in terms of how they view service when they get asked by a commander-in-chief to do something. I think Bill Barr has a very expansive view of presidential authority, and we saw that play out in various ways, and I think that was part of what appealed to him about coming back. Pompeo, I think, is one of the most ambitious politicians I've ever seen in my life, and I think he thought this was helpful to him. And I think that's true for a lot of people who worked for Trump. They thought that it wasn't just, it's a chance to work for a president, which is what you were looking at it. So yes, that's a personal point, but I think a lot of folks thought they were going to get something out of it. And what they got out of it was January 6th.
Yeah, we're going to get there. That happens to be my birthday, by the way, which is there's some irony.
Wow.
Yeah, a little bit of trivia for you. I share the same birthday as Eric Trump. So on his 37th birthday, his father was trying to overthrow the government. And on my 57th birthday, I was like, oh my God, this guy is really as stupid as I thought he was. But here we are. 3 things you say in the book, which I like. I mean, I like so many things in the book, but these are things about his moods and his behavior. I'm going to read them back to you, okay? He had a couple of moves. He would shift blame, the quick lie, the counterattack, the misdirection, the performative anger, sort of this angry outburst to push people back. He understood the power of that seat about as well as anybody. You know, when you're sitting in the Oval Office with him, I don't care who you are, he's the president, you're not.
Mm-hmm.
It can be intimidating to people.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that. Tell us about how you dealt with it as a journalist, and tell us about how, you know, I mean, he's called you every different name in the book, yet he still calls you like you're his psychotherapist. So tell us about that whole thing.
Well, so one thing, I haven't talked to him since September 2021, and that was my third interview for the book. In February of last year, I reported that he was flushing documents down toilets, and that was, you know, he issued a statement calling me a maggot, and that was the last time I talked to him. And he has, you know, sort of sent me cryptic messages, or that are alleged to be from him through various people. But that's it. You know, he is an intimidating figure to a lot of people. And to your point about how he would use the office was almost a set piece to that. One of the things I talk about in the prologue is just his bullying impulse. I talk about it in the epilogue, at the end of the book too. So it was perfect for him. It was a perfect match. You know, I remember an interview that my colleague Glenn Thrush and I did with him, and I think it was April of 2017. And we walked in, and there were something like 12 aides in the room, and he was flanked on one side by Gary Cohn and you know, Reed Cordish and this one and that one, and then Jared Kushner, and all these people. The vice president walked in at one point, Reince Priebus walked in at one point, and you got the sense that it was rolling heavy, and it was meant to. It was stage directing. So, you know, I think anyone who has, you know, been in his presence has experienced that. I also think that anyone who's been in his presence has experienced, as you have, the salesman side of him, where he's trying to charm or woo you. I have certainly experienced multiple times asking him a question on something and having him just lie about it and try to get out of it that way. He is, I think that most reporters, certainly in Washington, which is not exactly a place known for a deep brand of honesty, but I don't think any Washington-based reporter had covered somebody who lied about things both big and small the way that Trump does. And I think it was very challenging for the press corps to try to pin him down on any manner of things.
I want to move quickly through this interview and go right to January 6th.
Sure.
Was January 6th surprising to you?
No, it was not. It was shocking, but not surprising.
It's shocking, not surprising, right?
Yeah.
You know, so someone like a Michael Cohen said it was going to happen. People asked me. I said, well, look, he's not going to ever concede. He said in 2016 that if he lost, he would declare fraud. Of course, he won, so therefore he didn't declare fraud.
That's right.
So
and the Iowa caucuses were fake, according to him, in 2016 because he lost them. Yeah.
Right. And of course, the him on tape in the bus grabbing people by the blank, he then went on to say that wasn't him.
Yeah, he said they were investigating. He told the senator that they were investigating whether that was really him. I mean, look, I was not on December. It's really amazing to me the degree to which people were around him were, and you see this in the January 6th House Committee's work and all of our reporting. People were aware of exactly what was going on in the White House, and people were hoping he would, averting their gazes, hoping he would let it go, hoping it would stop. So I broke the story about that crazy Oval Office meeting on December 18th, 2020, that you've seen a lot of video about in those House hearings. And I broke it on December 19th, and I got a call from a Senate Republican staffer who said to me, are we going to have a problem? Actually, I think I got a text. Are we going to have a problem with a peaceful transfer of power? And I said, yes, you are. Like, that's should be very visible here. And the person explained to me that Kushner and Meadows were telling GOP leadership that, you know, everything was going to be fine. Trump was going to concede. It was going to be okay. Or he was, you know, everything was going to be okay. It was so not to be okay. And so, it was not surprising to me. And it was not surprising to me also another story that I helped break and that was cited in the report was Annie Carney and I reported on January 5th that Pence had told Trump he wasn't going to do what Trump wanted in terms of dismissing the results in the Electoral College certification. And Trump had put out a statement saying we were wrong. Pence and I see this the same way. Trump obviously knew he was saying something that was not true. So no, I was not surprised because Trump was fighting this up until the very last minute. And by the way, Anthony, so much of all of our reporting from real time held up in what we saw from the committee, but that's a side note.
Right. Well, no, listen, I mean, one of the reasons why I got on the wrong side of him was my feelings about the press. And by the way, I think I have license. I've been lit up by the press. I've been grinded by late night comedy. I actually don't care. I think it's part of the process if you're going to go into politics. And so, I wrote an op-ed saying that the press is not the enemy of the people. It was in the Hill in April of 2019. He went ballistic on me and told me I was no longer on his team, which that was fine. But the question I have for you is, why is he still, all your reporting, the most recent report today where, you're writing in the New York Times today that he knows that the election wasn't rigged and he knows that he lost the election. We all know that he knows that, and yet he perpetuates this lie. Why are people still kowtowing and supporting him? Why is there no backbone leadership? Why didn't McCarthy and McConnell and others say, hey, you know what, this is absolutely wrong? And why? Is it really just his political base and his power? Is that the reason? I mean, are there no principles and there's no courage at all to stand up for this wrong-headed and illegal behavior?
Do you watch Curb Your Enthusiasm? Are you a Larry David person?
I do, yes.
So there's
how could you not? I mean,
right.
I mean, remember, I'm a New Yorker. Jews and Italians see the world very similarly. So yeah, there's
an episode where he has a cast member from the show Survivor and a Holocaust survivor at a dinner. I think it might have been a Seder, and they're yelling at each other and fighting. And somebody knocks over a glass of wine and red wine. And it gets all over the tablecloth. And Larry David's mother-in-law says, somebody get a sponge. And she just sits there and says, somebody get a sponge. And he says, why don't you get a sponge? And to me, that is how so many people have approached Donald Trump, is someone else will be the person who deals with him. I don't have to, but someone will. And so in the case of McCarthy, yes, it's about the base. It's about McCarthy's own ambitions. We talked about ambition before in terms of all, various officials. You talked about it for yourself. McCarthy has wanted to be House Speaker for as long as I can remember. And so he almost had it once before and lost it because of an uprising from the right. And, I think that.
And also his own behavior, his own behavior caught him. He's also, he got caught on Hannity, interview explaining the diabolical nature of what they did to Hillary Clinton and things like that. I mean, look, Kevin was a friend of mine. I consider Kevin a friend. He's spoken at the SALT conference. Mm-hmm. You could see me on his donor list. I think that people like him and Stefanik, they've totally morphed themselves. They've disfigured themselves for some reason. I guess it's you really learn not to be overly cynical, but you really learn what people are about in politics when they do these things. But let's talk about you for a second, okay? Have you ever had a relationship with anybody that you've covered like the relationship that you have with Donald Trump, okay? There's antipathy in the relationship, but there's a bizarre attraction of Donald Trump to you, almost like, the New York Times, whatever it might be, to get their support or to put a charm offensive on you or the New York Times. He's calling you at all hours of the night. Ever had a relationship like that?
So I reject the term relationship because it suggests some kind of give and take. He's a figure who I cover. I have never experienced a figure I cover who is so uniquely obsessed with the press.
And I like that, by the way. I'm gonna interject for a second. I do like that because I shouldn't have said relationship.
That's okay.
I should have said interaction, because people that tell me they're friends with Donald Trump, I'm like, you're not friends with Donald Trump,
right,
okay?
Right. Donald Trump doesn't really have friends, and so number one, and number two.
Okay, let me rephrase it then. So your interactions with him, have you ever had interactions with him like this?
No, because I've never. I mean, look, he is uniquely obsessed with the New York Times, and that's what it's about with me. Just to be clear, he is obsessed with the paper to a degree that I have never seen in any official. If anybody wants to understand how he feels about the New York Times, go back and listen to an episode of the New York Times podcast, The Daily, from February 2019, where he's having this back and forth with our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger. And A.G. is literally talking about really important issues like, hey, your language is being used by despots around the globe to crack down on press freedoms. And Trump keeps saying, I think I'm entitled to a good story from my paper. And that really tells you all you need to know about how he sees things versus, how the free press sees things. And he just doesn't understand what the free press does. He has no clue. I asked him during that same meeting what he thinks our role is. And I think he said to cover things accurately and fairly, which is, what that's our objective, but that's not why we exist. And so, no, I've never experienced anything like this. And also, look, he's not the first person to get upset about my coverage, Anthony. Rudy Giuliani used to yell at us in the Blue Room at City Hall all the time when I was covering him as mayor. And he was
part of the sport. I mean, you can't be in the NFL. I mean, just terrible tragedy that happened in the NFL. But you're in the NFL and you get a concussion. Okay, you're in the NFL. I mean, you're in politics. You're going to get concussed by the journalists. Okay, it's just the way it happens. But do you think that you're not his shrink? But I got to ask you this question because I think
I am not. That is true.
But I do think he thinks you are. But do you think in his quiet moments? When I see Donald Trump and I think of him in his quiet moments, I see self-loathing. Do I have that right?
So I think he treats all of us like we're his psychiatrists, as I write. So I just want to make that very clear. I don't think that he has one. I think he uses all of us for therapy, and I'm not sure how many quiet moments he has. I will say I spoke to a lot of people who knew him in the 1990s and the 2000s who said that they believe that he is there's not a whole lot of love for self there, that there's a lot of internal self-denigration. Now, whether they're just grafting sort of normal behavior for somebody who's behaved so self-destructively onto him, it's hard to tell. I don't think he's given to enormous self-reflection.
So I have two last questions for you. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
You wrote at the end of your book that when you interviewed him after the election loss, he seemed shrunken. Mm-hmm. Elaborate on that.
I think we've seen a steady shrinkage of him, right? I mean, I think when I first went to see him was March of 2021. He just seems small. And some of that is just not being president anymore. I mean, I remember the first time that I saw Bill Clinton after the presidency, and he seemed smaller. The only person post-president, the two post-presidents who seemed the happiest in my viewing in modern history were Obama and Bush W. They both seemed really happy to leave DC. I think that Bill Clinton did not like leaving the stage. I think Donald Trump certainly did not. But he just seemed diminished. He didn't seem to know what to do with, he's not pressing the red button for the Diet Coke anymore. He can't command an army. He can't go, fire up Marine One. He just seemed small. And I think that we have seen him seeming progressively smaller over time. It doesn't mean he won't still potentially be the nominee for president. He may, I mean, somebody has to beat him. But assuming that he stays in the race, there are only a few people I can see doing that. But yet he does not seem dominant the way he once did.
Okay, last question. Who covers him well?
That's a good question.
Let's say Maggie Abraham covers him the best, but who covers him well besides you?
Well, thanks. But I think Jonathan Swan and Josh Dawsey and Mike Bender are all really, really, really strong reporters on the Trump beat. I think Jonathan Swan's Off the Rails series was one of the best pieces of journalism about the final days of Trump.
Yeah. Very good. No, it was good. When does the paperback come out, right, Matt?
It's a good question. I think a couple months. It'll be easier. It'll be less heavy to carry around. So, look at it that way.
I will listen. It was an awesome book. Appreciate
Thanks,
your time.
Anthony.
Confidence, man, the making of Donald Trump and the breaking of America. People will be studying your book, Maggie. It'll be 50 years from now. It'll be in a political science curriculum somewhere, for sure. And so congratulations on the book. And, I look forward to many more years of your successful reporting, but hopefully it won't be about a future President Trump, which is not out of the question. We both
It's
know
not.
that.
No,
we
people
both
who
know
think
that
people who think that it's out of the question are kidding themselves.
They're not reading the situation properly. But
That's
I'm
right.
not saying it's going to happen. I mean, I'll work hard to make sure that it doesn't, as will many other people. But it could happen. Thank you so much, and
Thank you.
it's a pleasure to have you.